So next up we have virtual desktops. Now, when we think of our desktop, we think of our image that we see on our screen where we have our nice background and we have our different icons and our different shortcuts and files and folders. But our virtual desktops allow us full connectivity through not just our background and our folders and files and icons, but virtual desktops allow us to have a virtualized computer virtualized entire computer that we can connect to and allow all of our different files and folders and applications to remain consistent. How much we're virtualizing with our different virtual desktops may vary. We may have a full suite of an entire virtual computer, or we may just virtualize some files and folders and icons to keep them consistent when we're moving around. Virtual desktops allow us to have the ability to have a consistent files and folders and desktop essentially while we move around to different places on our network or even use different computers. Now we have two main categories of virtual desktops that we're going to talk about, and we have our remote desktop virtualization and our local desktop virtualization. Now our big difference between the two is that our remote desktop virtualization is going to execute everything remotely, whereas our local desktop virtualization is going to execute our different components locally. So let's take a look at what that means. So with our remote desktop virtualization, we're going to have an entire virtual desktop with remote data that we connect to over our network or connect to over the internet, just depending on how we're utilizing our different component. So say we're at home and we say, oh, I need to grab a file from work that I need to connect to. Well, rather than setting up a VPN that we VPN in and then connect to our shared folder and see if we can pull down the file, we can just simply log into our remote desktop application, which will allow us to connect virtually to our remote desktop. And we keep that same remote desktop on a server that we are also accessing when we're at work. So this remote desktop virtualization keeps consistent folders everywhere. So whether we're accessing our data at work or we're accessing our remote desktop at home, we can use that data is the same no matter where we go. That data is the same everywhere. And if we work on the data when we're at home, it saves it on the server. And if we work on that data at work, it saves it on the server. Now, remote desktop virtualization also allows for remote data execution. So say we have a virtualized desktop that we're connecting to over the internet, and we have the virtualized desktop coming up on our computer, and we try to run an application. Say we have a version of Photoshop, or we have a powerful graphical or design editor on our virtualized desktop on our server. And we say, okay, I need to run this application. Well, that application is going to be run on the server. So we're going to be using the server's resources. We're going to be using the server's memory and CPU and processing power in order to access that resource. So if we have a more powerful server that can handle all of those requests and a less powerful computer, that may be what we want, because we don't want to necessarily take up our local resources. We'd rather use server resources. Now, the downside to this is that it requires a constant network connection. If we're going to be utilizing those server resources and we're going to be running that application on the server, we need to have a very good, strong network connection that's constantly up, or else we're going to notice that, say, we'll get a message that pops up and says, hey, you're currently disconnected, trying to reconnect, and you won't be able to do anything with that application for a while because it's executing on the server. Now, the flip side to this remote data execution is going to be our local desktop virtualization. Now, our local desktop virtualization has our virtual machine, our virtual desktop running locally. Now, how does it do this? If we're running our local desktop locally, then how is this providing us with our consistent folders? How is this providing us with really any benefit other than just having a virtual machine on our computer? Well, with our local desktop virtualization, these virtual disks and virtual images can be synchronized to a server. So as we're making changes, as we're changing files and running applications, then that virtual disk whenever it can be synchronized to the server is synchronized to the server. And if we have a different computer that we're trying to work on, if we have a different computer that we're trying to run this virtual desktop on, it's going to pull the most recent image from the server so that it'll keep that synchronized image across all of our different devices. Now, the main difference between our local desktop virtualization and our remote desktop virtualization comes in where we're using our local resources. So if we were to launch an application on our local computer here, if we were to launch an application such as our graphical editor or our design editor, we're going to be using our local resources. So our computer is going to have the data on its physical computer, and rather than executing that data remotely and utilizing the server's resources in order to run that program, it's going to be using our computer's resources in order to run that program. So if we have a more powerful computer and a server that really doesn't have as much powerful computing processes, it really only is being used to store that data. It has a good network connection, and it allows us to synchronize our folders and our data to that server, and provides us with that constant everywhere folders and files and applications. That's great. But this server may have a lot of space. It may have a lot of hard disk space to save that information, but it may not have a very powerful CPU, or may not have a ton of memory in order to run applications from multiple users at the same time. So we say, okay, well, we're going to use our local desktop here in order to run that application, to use our local resources. Now, the benefit of this is that once we've synchronized our folder, our virtual desktop, and once we're starting to run that application, if for some reason our network does sort of stagger, or our network has intermittent connectivity or a little bit less connectivity than we would need over here, then we're still going to be able to run that application without interruption. We're going to be able to run that program, run that application, and not get that message that says you don't have connectivity, because we're running that application remotely. We're not using the server's resources. And then as we're making changes, as we're saving files and folders, whenever our computer can, it's going to go ahead and it's going to save that data remotely. So the difference between the two, again, is our main difference between our remote desktop virtualization and our local desktop virtualization is going to be whether our data executes locally or remotely. So depending on our environment and depending on our connectivity, we may want to sort of determines for us whether we're going to use that full remote desktop virtualization, or if we're going to want to set up local desktop virtualization where we have everything synchronized to our server.